Sir Topham Hatt and Miss Jenny looked sternly at Thomas. They were both cross. Thomas knew why he had done it, but he was too ashamed to tell Sir Topham Hatt, Miss Jenny, the Winks, the Brats, and the other engines, so he said nothing. Sir Topham Hatt was very cross. The other engines and some of the girls started to whisper. Yasmin was sorry to see Thomas looking so upset. She tried to comfort him, but Thomas had steamed away sadly. Thomas found an old track. He wanted to be alone. Stanley soon found Thomas, looking sad. Stanley felt sorry for Thomas. Later, Sir Topham Hatt gathered everyone together. All the engines sadly agreed, and Thomas felt sadder. The engines puffed away. After that, no one spoke to Thomas. He was no longer in charge, and he felt he was no longer wanted. That night, Stanley decided to stay at Knapford with Percy and his Stilesville friends. Stella scoffed sad loudly. Percy, feeling more upset than Thomas, was worried. Just then, Gerald popped out of his lamp. Gerald acts like a newscaster. Percy was cross. Soon everyone was asleep, but Layla couldn't sleep at all. She kept thinking how lonely Thomas was, so making sure everyone was still asleep, she flew off to Great Waterton. Layla arrived at Great Waterton and found Thomas still awake. Jack and Alfie had already loaded the rubble into the waiting trucks. Layla wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but Thomas had already started shunting the trucks away. Soon Layla found Thomas just finishing up. Then she spotted one last truck that had rolled in front of an old mine. She told Thomas about it. So Thomas went to fetch the truck. But then there was trouble. Thomas biffed the truck too hard and it rolled straight into the mine. Thomas and Layla looked into the hole. It was very dark. But before Layla could even think about stopping Thomas, he had already puffed inside the mine. The mine was dark, but Thomas was lucky to have his lantern. Soon he spotted the truck clatter down a slope and disappeared round a bend. And Thomas raced after the truck over the old track and round the bend. Thomas spotted the truck again, so he steamed after it up and down the hilly mine track. He didn't take his eyes off the truck. As he chased the truck along the shaft, he was starting to have a wondrous time. He raced as fast as he can to catch the truck. But then a junction came into view. The truck sped along the white track, and Thomas sped down the left track. Soon, Thomas forgot the truck. He was having too much fun on the roller coaster track. But just then, his fun soon ended in horror. The tunnel was blocked. Thomas saw the blockage. He tried to stop, but it was too late. He bashed through the blockage and splashed in a pool of water below. It soon turned scary as Thomas felt himself moving. Thomas called out, but no one could hear him. Thomas was alone. The next morning, the Winks, the Brats, and the other engines arrived for work. They were now waiting for Thomas. They all looked, but Thomas wasn't there. There was no sign of him at all. Lashana arrived at Knapford and found Stella. And just as she was backing up, she bumped into Gerald's lamp. Gerald comes out, talking on his cell phone. But Stella wasn't interested in finding Thomas. Henry popped in. Stella knew that both Gerald and Henry were right, so she agreed to help. James meanwhile went to see if the narrow gauge engine seen Thomas. Next, Percy found Jack and his team. In the tunnel, Thomas started to go faster. He realized he was on a fast-moving rapid. the water surged under him. Sir Topham Hatt was cold. He could see everyone was sad. Sir Topham Hatt could see that Percy was starting to cry. Deep inside the mine, Thomas was washed and splashed as the wet bricks carried him through the tunnel. Sir Topham Hatt drove all over the island from lookout point to lookout point. The Shiner had arrived at the wharf, hoping Thomas would be there, but he wasn't. The Whigs Club took to the air with Percy below, following them. High in the hills, the little engines puffed and peered, but sadly no one could find Thomas. They all returned to Great Waterton, tired and sad. Sir Topham Hatt looked at the tumbled tower. Everyone knew that Percy was right. Musa was right, so Stella climbed on board Stanley and they set off along the way. They passed a train of trucks waiting for Stanley, but he wasn't thinking about trucks. Stanley was thinking about Thomas. The day he was seen taking Annie and Clarabelle, the evening at Titmouth, and Thomas's face after the accident. In the tunnel, Thomas started to feel cold. The water had his fire put out in seconds. Stanley and Stella arrived at the hidden hills, but only his echo came back. Back in the tunnel with her, Thomas was scared because up ahead stood a thick wall of bushes. Suddenly, he crashed through them, flew over a ravine, and landed on the other side with a thud. He started rolling down the bank trees, and rocks were everywhere. Thomas bumped and bashed over them. Soon, he stopped at the bottom of the hill and was stuck. He spotted an old track next to where he landed. But Thomas didn't move at all, and all Thomas could do was worry, wait, and hope. Stanley and Stella had looked everywhere, but there was still no sign of Thomas. Stanley waited as Stella flew off to find Thomas from the air. As he waited, Stanley thought that pretty soon he and Stella would have to return to Great Waterton. In the ditch, Thomas was thinking about Great Waterton. He remembered the tower and the truck smashing into it, and the tower smashing to the ground. Thomas sat in the ditch looking sadder than ever. In the air, Stella looked all over until then Stella flew back to Stanley. So Stanley blew his whistle, hoping Thomas would hear it. Thomas did hear the whistle. So, with one last puff, Thomas blew his whistle loudly. Stella and Stanley both heard it. Stella took to the air again, and Stanley steamed onto the old line. Thomas had no more steam to whistle. Just then, Stella flew into view. Stanley puffed in,